Bitcoin on Wednesday hit a new all-time high of more than 66,000
Now it's starting to actually gain some traction.
If you're stupid enough to buy it, you'll pay the price for it one day.
It has quintupled in value over the last year.
Elon Musk makes one of his riskiest bets ever.
Money is just a number in a database.
We're talking about a decentralized
world. The supply of dollars can never be sufficient to satisfy the debts that it creates.
Bitcoin has hit an all-time high again. Google has invested $1 billion in exchange that trades Bitcoin ETFs, and the New York mayor and the Miami mayor battle it out for which city is the most crypto-friendly. Welcome to All Time High, a crypto podcast. I'm your host, David Vader, and my co-host here, Swerty.
Hey man, great to be here again. And I'm really looking forward to talking about the new all-time high. And we've got some great articles to discuss today.
Absolutely, man. Very exciting, of course. We've come into this game at the very right time for the name of our podcast. And that is the first article that we're talking about today. Bitcoin price has surged to more than 68,000 US dollars. Now, of course, that's close to, I think it's 90,000 Australian, which is
nearly
obscene,
isn't it? It's fantastic. We'll break the 100,000 on the Australian one first, obviously, because of the exchange rate. But I think we're eyeing off the 100,000 very nicely. And we're going to see how Plan B's prediction pans out.
Yeah, of course, Plan B being the Twitter analyst that has predicted a very high number for Bitcoin. I forget the specific numbers, but
it was like 160,000 or something. I'll have to go back over that, but 128,000 by the end of December, something like that. I'm sure we'll correct ourselves, but he's going quite bullish on that one. So
absolutely, and I do like the fact, as you pointed out, we're going to hit 100K before the US does. I like that our 100,000 isn't really a psychological barrier. You know what I mean? We're going to hit 100K. People aren't really thinking much about it because most of it's traded in US dollars. But of course, we're sitting here pretty.
And it looks really good on paper, doesn't it? That 100K.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, of course, like look at El Salvador already. The article I was reading the other day was they're pledging to build 20 new schools with the profits that they've already made on that investment. And that's fantastic news that he's going to be using that money to actually invest in education, which is something I think El Salvador could really use this time.
That's right. Yeah, a real success story there. And it really is leading the way for other countries who are thinking about doing the same thing, other nation states potentially converting even a portion of their balance sheet. Of course, El Salvador went crazy and they said, this is now a national currency. Other nation states may not follow to that degree, but they may, convert some of their balance sheet. And of course, this is a huge success story and leading the charge globally with respect to Bitcoin returns, using it for good things.
Exactly.
Yep. And of course, all over the world, we've got huge investments being made in this space. Google has now come out and said they're going to invest $1 billion in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And that exchange, of course, trades Bitcoin futures. So while it's not a direct balance sheet purchase of Bitcoin, we would have loved to see Google throw $1 billion into Bitcoin directly. But this is kind of a way of them getting a little exposure to that market.
Yeah, of course. And Google, they're enormous as a company, and having exposure to Bitcoin is a very smart move. I imagine it won't be long before we see them actually holding assets, if they don't already, direct Bitcoin and crypto assets. But this is a great first move, especially for such a high-profile company as Google.
Yep, absolutely. And, I think a lot of other companies will follow suit, whether that's getting, exposure directly to Bitcoin or through platforms like this that trade Bitcoin, being on the market maker side of this.
Yeah, of course. And one interesting thing is CME is obviously a large institution themselves. Their main client is BlackRock, who is the world's largest asset fund manager. So they actually overlook about $9 trillion worth of assets worldwide. Puts them in one of the big three, along with Citadel and Vanguard. And that's an enormous company with some extremely high-profile companies that are involved with them. So that's huge news.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's massive news.
And actually, I'm going to segue into another, I guess, crypto project that I've been reading about, which is Mbridge. So this is a central bank project where mostly Asian backed at the moment, between China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE, United Arab Emirates. And what they want to do essentially is create a platform for banks to trade cross-border payments. So a lot of the problems occur when you're sending large amounts of money, especially for retail investment and exchanges. You're looking at large costs for those transactions. And so this Mbridge wants to reduce those costs significantly. And they're saying basically average is about 7%. So they want to get that down to about 3.5% on transaction costs, specifically international costs. And this is going to be a regulated crypto platform. What that means is essentially these banks are going to control what happens with those funds and those transactions, and they'll have their own ledger. But this was expected. I think most reserve banks and most countries, their banks themselves that work and operate within those countries, they're going to develop their own crypto platforms. And that regulation is important. I don't think all retail investors are ready to really just go all in, get their own wallets, look after their own funds. I mean, how many times do you check your address when you're sending ETH or Bitcoin or whatever? Like you look, even like, $1, you're like, oh, is it right?
Yeah.
Not a lot of retail mum and dads or just retail people in general have the confidence at the moment because of the pre-existing system, which you've got these intermediary people in banks who look over that. They can change transaction problems. They can help you out with all those sort of issues. With crypto, it's between you and the other wallet, essentially. So, this is a first step, and I think it's going to be interesting to see where that goes, especially with large money in Asia and the Middle East, especially connecting all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a fascinating article, and it does get pretty complex. But I think I see this as a step in the direction of removing the US as potentially being a reserve asset, or at least providing countries more of an option when it comes to selecting how to settle securities and things. So, while this isn't directly threatening that, I think it's a step in that direction, in that it enables that to occur in the future. And of course, if that happens, the world needs a currency that isn't printed by a central bank, because by having the US as the world reserve currency, essentially the world is at the mercy of that reserve bank, and that reserve bank can devalue that currency. The minute the US company buys something from, say, China, that money goes over to China and it suddenly becomes worth less, because the Chinese, they know that currency is going to be continuing to get devalued. They need to spend that, and they spend that into investments. They buy real estate. They put it into other things, sending that money away. It's like a hot potato. You don't want to hold it too long. You want to pass it on. Yeah,
that's right.
So that's fascinating, the Mbridge stuff. We did have this week the mayor of Miami came out and said that he's going to be taking his next paycheck in Bitcoin. Immediately, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, the new mayor of New York, said, "You know what? I'm going to take my next 3 paychecks in Bitcoin." And then after that,
Bitcoin energy.
Yeah, exactly. They're competing to be to become the hub of crypto. Which city will become crypto city? And of course, them battling it out. Whoever wins, it's good for Bitcoin. It's good for crypto, and so of course we support it.
I love hearing about this sort of stuff, and I've been seeing occasionally. I can't remember off the top of my head, but American sports stars in the NFL and NBA accepting their first checks or certain parts of their salaries in Bitcoin, and that's a really smart move on their behalf, because I mean I'm absolutely pro Bitcoin. I'm very bullish on this, but for them to do that, it's not a big risk on the behalf of the mayors or these professional athletes who already have a lot of sponsors, a lot of money, big paychecks. But it's really good to see high profile people doing this in general.
That's right. It's encouraging the masses, and it's also saying to the masses, you know what? And not only to the consumer masses, but it's saying to the institutions, This is here to stay. Bitcoin is okay. It's okay for you to invest in Bitcoin. And that's really powerful. Of course, I think underlying that, you mentioned some athletes that have been putting their salaries into Bitcoin as well. I think there's an underlying assumption that, look, holding US dollars or holding dollars is like that hot potato I mentioned before. It's hot. You don't want to hold it for too long. You need to invest it because otherwise inflation is going to eat away your value. No one wants to do that.
It really will. And one of the issues is when you're hedged to a currency such as the US dollar, pegged to it rather, it can cause all sorts of issues depending on how your particular reserve bank and your economy handles that. One thing that I've been watching for the last couple of years, actually on and off in certain articles, I've got some friends who are, is how the Lebanese pound has been essentially just crashing. Lebanon's been having a really tough time. They went through civil war for decades, and then in the late 90s, they pegged their currency to the US dollar, as most countries effectively did. Recently, because of the pandemic, what's been happening in Lebanon is they're going to come out and essentially the country's broke. They're going to have to default on the Eurobond. I think they have, which is a large amount of money. They can't pay the debts that they already owe. So what we're seeing is runaway inflation occurring. Prices for everyday items have gone up nearly 500, 600%. Just for beans and general market produce that the Lebanese have. And one of the problems with inflation is no one wants your currency either. So it becomes really hard for you to have any kind of international trade. People aren't interested in doing business with someone who's essentially broke. So the Lebanese are going into a liquidity crisis, and the only way out of this is the IMF is going to have to step in, essentially just give them more credit. This is a great argument, kind of segueing back to El Salvador. You want to have some sort of reserve that allows for, not inflation, essentially. You don't want inflation. Inflation, whilst the natural step of economics, it really essentially occurs because an excess of supply. So supply and demand. The bolognese thing, if there's too many bowls of bolognese and pasta being served up to you, you don't want any more. And if everyone in the family's had it, they don't want it either. So you can't give it away. So what's happening is we see El Salvador's taken on Bitcoin for different reasons. I would expect to see other South American countries potentially start taking it on because of neighbor influence. They're really close to El Salvador, but also similar issues with their own economies. It would be very interesting if Lebanon started taking on this as a consideration, especially with things like Enbridge, which are starting to link Asia and, you've got the Middle East. They're starting to look at these options to move away from having a US-backed currency.
That's right. Yeah. And we talk about, inflation on this show quite a bit. Of course, we don't often touch on the devastating effects of it. You're talking about the people of Lebanon going through this, 90% devaluation recently. And of course, when you're burdened with so much debt, the response generally is inflate my way out of it. Because the more money that I flood into the system, then that debt can be paid back. Problem is, it never really works, does it?
No, it's a slippery slope.
That's right. And inflation keeps going up. So, I really feel for the people of Lebanon and, before that, the people of Venezuela, and before that, the people of Zimbabwe. All of these.
Yeah, numerous African countries. And historically, even, you look back as far as time and currency go, there's been inflation. And we've seen, classic examples being like France ruining their own currency.
That's right. There was
1700s or whatever.
That's right. It's always the poor that get affected by this as well. I did see an article, we didn't include it in our show today, about the Netherlands, experiencing fairly high inflation, the highest it's been for a long time. And 4%. This is starting to take over. Europe is starting to take over South America. These are the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. They're the ones that go first, and then things start to pick up in other countries. And of course, it's a long process, but it gets there, and it gets there because there's too much cash flooding the system. Just this week, the Australian Reserve Bank signaled the end of ultra cheap money. And of course, you and I know that this is all just rhetoric. The Reserve Bank of Australia, has been buying up bonds to control the yield curve, and they've now announced that they're abandoning its policy of the yield curve control. Now, in my mind, I immediately hear alarm bells because it's a bit of double speak. That famous saying from one of those dystopian books where you say one thing and you mean the opposite. Basically, what the Reserve Bank is saying is we're going to actually keep propping the economy up with cheap cash, but we don't want to outright say it because that's going to drive people crazy. So we're going to say the opposite. We're going to say, you know what? We're going to actually pull back on ultra cheap money. Meanwhile, they're printing the hell out of it, and they're buying up bonds, and they're controlling the yield curve, and they've got the interest rate the lowest it's ever been, and they're flooding the economy with cheap cash. What does that do to assets like real estate and stocks and everything else? It props them up. It brings them up. Of course, that includes Bitcoin, but Bitcoin's different because Bitcoin provides a way out of this system.
It's essentially, being deflationary, it is a hedge against inflation. And, we've seen the Fed have used quantitative easing. They've been also printing a lot of money. Janet Yellen talked about instituting yield curve control by the Fed. It can be a really good way to calm down that kind of a problem. It's going to be interesting to see how, obviously what happened was it hit a certain level, and Australia has decided to move down a different pathway. I'm curious to see how that pans out over the next 6 to 12 months.
We will see. And,
interest rates.
I mentioned this before we started recording, they could do it for a little while. Maybe they'll do it for 6 months. Maybe they'll do it for a year. Maybe if they stretch it out, they can pull back on the ultra cheap money printing for a couple of years. But ultimately, you can't continue to do that, because then the assets start to deflate, and then your voter base is starting to get poorer and poorer, and they don't vote you in anymore. Simple as that.
Yeah, as soon as it hits the bottom line, people feel that one. It's a tangible issue, and people go, nah, hang on a second, I don't have enough money. And one of the issues we're facing in Australia is this is due to the global shipping crisis, of course. Australian consumers have been warned to get their Christmas shopping done now. This is not the normal rhetoric that every retail store on November 1st with their little trees propped up and the Christmas music starts playing. This is not the same rhetoric. This is a rhetoric which basically means the supply chains are in crisis. We're not going to have all the items that you want. And if you're shipping from overseas, make sure you get it in because there's a lot of delays. Of course, we had COVID's been a problem. We had the Suez Canal was a major issue, which has only just recently sort of been solved and fixed. One of the places I was doing some work for recently had a huge shipment all come in at once due to that ship being caught. And we got all of that. But also the COVID backlog, everything came in at once, which was a headache in its own self. So one of these issues is we're starting to realize that globalization has some major flaws, especially when it comes to issues such as COVID. But when you start also applying issues where economies are facing inflation, economies don't have the reserve capital to effectively just make the products that we're asking for, you start having issues with supply chains. And yeah, we're going to start seeing this hurt. I started seeing prices edging towards $1.80 for petrol today. And we mentioned this last week. See the prices start going up. I can imagine that is just going to keep creeping up over the next 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, $1.80 per litre here in Australia. I don't know what that is in gallons in the US for our US.
For us, that's quite high for the US listeners, but that's very high.
Significantly high. That's right. I mean, this is, the article even mentions that this is off the back of a perfect storm of COVID-related supply chain issues. And I would say that it's not just a coalescing of COVID-related supply chain issues. It's global shortages coalescing with inflation, which is driving up all of these commodities. Your copper for plumbing a new house is going up. Your timber for building houses or building pallets to ship things on is going up. Everything is going up. And what does that do when it's combined with these disruptions in the global supply chain? Well, it amplifies it. It creates 1,000x instead of just adding them together. It's multiplying the problem. And the way out of this is Bitcoin. And we know that. We talk a lot about inflation. And of course, the podcast is a Bitcoin podcast. But Bitcoin is the way.
We love all crypto, but let's nod the head to the king of crypto.
Yes, the granddaddy. And we know this. It's the way out of this system. It's the answer to it. And I've been evangelizing this for years. We have in Australia some more local news, I suppose, where we had recently launched a BetaShares crypto ETF. Basically, you gain exposure to companies that are exposed to crypto in some way. You've got your.
It's not direct, but it's a good little idea.
Yeah, it's not a direct buy. It's not a direct spot ETF, but you're getting access to companies like MicroStrategy, Silvergate Capital, Marathon Digital, those sort of things. Coinbase as well. This ETF broke records within the first 15 minutes of listing, smashed Australian security records. So there is such a demand in the market, but in particular, there's a demand for regulated assets on traditional exchanges. And that's because I think businesses or investment funds or institutional investors, they can't just go and buy Bitcoin from your local local Bitcoins dealer. They need to buy it through a regulated trust. They need to buy it through these ETFs, and that's why these records are getting broken.
Absolutely, and we're seeing a really interesting efflorescence of companies, which is essentially people are joining forces. We can't quite get the exposure to Bitcoin as an ETF.
Efflorescence, by the way, I love that word. That's
yeah, it's great. A combination. It's a good word. I've been listening to a lot of David Graeber lately, and he loves that word.
Nice.
Essentially, that means combination. So we're seeing companies get brought together. ETFs, obviously, the next step I would love to see is a spot ETF for Bitcoin.
Of course.
And one thing that came up this week, which I was really excited about, is the CBA, Commonwealth Bank, has announced that it's going to become Australia's first bank to offer customers the ability to buy, sell, and hold crypto assets directly through the CommBank app. Now, there's two sides to this. First, there's a touch of irony in that it's a bank giving access to customers for, a decentralized crypto. You got to start somewhere. And right. As I said before, a lot of retail investors don't want to have all of that responsibility. They want to allow banks and to have that ecclesiastical control over their funds. People are scared with money. Obviously, there's been a lot of scams recently, more than in years gone by. You get the text messages, you get emails. There's a lot of scams out there, and money in general. Australians, in particular, millennials, they want access to crypto. They want access to Bitcoin. We're seeing huge interest in NTFs, NFTs. We're seeing huge interest in Bitcoin and other cryptos. And I think where it's going to start will be banks giving access to people to hold and sell and buy. And there will be regulations on that. But again, great first step.
That's right. It reminds me of that quote from Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. This is us winning. The banks all over the world first ignored crypto. Then they ridiculed it. They said, silly investments, tulip mania. And then they fought us. They said, no, we're not buying it. This is a bubble. You should sell your Bitcoin. And then now we're winning. They're jumping on board. If you can't beat them, join them. And that's exactly what the CBA is doing. Well, thanks so much for joining. I just wanted to, before wrapping up the show, I wanted to do a shout out to Sushi995, who left us a great review on Apple Podcasts, and likewise for 4-. Thanks so much, guys, for jumping on Apple and leaving a review. It means a lot to us, and it
really appreciate that. Thank you.
Helps us jump in the rankings and get this out to more people. And on our YouTube channel, we're getting a few comments as well. Really appreciate that, guys. Love it. And thank you so much. That's me signing off. Any last words, Sweaty?
I'm looking forward to next week. I think we'll have another all-time high. But of course, when Bitcoin's doing its thing, there's an all-time high every few hours. So, yeah.
Fantastic. I love
Bring
it.
on the moon.
Thanks so much, man.